Picture this: you're just 10 years old, playing in a crowd, when suddenly a man in elaborate robes walks up, points directly at you, and says, "That's the one." From that moment, your life is no longer your own. You no longer belong to your parents, no longer have a future to choose, and your very name becomes irrelevant. This isn't some fairy tale, this actually happened in ancient Rome. Today, we're diving into the most sacred and terrifying job in the Roman Empire, becoming a Vestal Virgin. In ancient Rome, being selected as a Vestal Virgin wasn't exactly winning the lottery. When families heard the news, they weren't jumping for joy, they were crying their eyes out. Why? Because it meant they'd lose their daughter forever. The selection process was brutal, like some twisted lottery. First, you had to be between 6 and 10 years old, with both parents still alive, and you had to be a pure Roman citizen. Most importantly, you had to be physically perfect, no defects, born from a legitimate marriage. Sounds like they were shopping for merchandise, right? The Pontifex Maximus, Rome's chief priest, would stand before a group of eligible girls and either draw lots or simply point and say, "You're it." The moment you were chosen, there was no going home ever again. Once selected, these girls were taken to the House of the Vestals, next to the Temple of Vesta. Sounds elegant, but it was basically a luxury prison. They had to stay there for 30 full years. 10 years learning, 10 years working, and 10 years teaching. Their main job? Keeping a fire burning that could never, ever go out. You might think, how hard can it be to tend a fire? But this flame represented the fate of the Roman Empire itself. If it went out, it meant Rome was doomed. Talk about pressure. And for those entire 30 years, they absolutely could not touch any man. I mean, touch, not even casual contact. Even normal conversations had to be carefully monitored, because if anyone suspected they'd done something inappropriate, the consequences would be horrifying. So what happened when a Vestal Virgin messed up? This is where our story gets truly terrifying. If the sacred fire went out, the responsible Vestal would be privately whipped. Notice I said, privately, in darkness, where no one could see. The Romans were clever, they knew that publicly beating these sacred women would damage their image. So they chose to carry out these brutal punishments in secret. But that wasn't the worst part. If a Vestal Virgin was believed to have broken her vow of chastity, what awaited her was burial alive. In 216 BCE, two Vestal Virgins, Oppia and Floronia, were accused of violating their vow of chastity. Their trial wasn't public, and we don't even know if they had a chance to defend themselves. Once found guilty, their fate was sealed. One chose suicide, but the other faced something far worse, being buried alive. The process was absolutely chilling. The condemned Vestal would be led through the Roman Forum wearing white robes, barefoot and veiled, like a bride walking to her wedding. But this wasn't a wedding, this was her funeral. The procession would stop at the Field of the Wicked, outside the city. There, they'd already dug an underground chamber with a bed, a lamp, some bread, water, and milk. The Romans were cunning, they provided these items to pretend this wasn't an execution, but rather, letting the gods decide her fate. Once she descended the steps, the entrance would be sealed with earth and stones. No one would ever hear from her again. When the food and water ran out, so did her life. The most ironic part. Romans insisted this wasn't murder. They said, "We gave her food and water, the gods will decide her fate." But in reality, this was one of the most cruel forms of execution imaginable. What made it even more horrifying was that the entire process happened in silence. No public execution scene, no crowds, no one even knew the exact burial location. These women were simply erased from history, as if they'd never existed at all. But here's what really gets me about this story. These weren't just random women, they were children when they were chosen. Little girls who had their entire lives stolen from them in the name of purity and honor. Think about it, a 6-year-old girl, torn from her family, forced to live in isolation for 3 decades, with the constant threat that one mistake, one moment of human weakness, could literally bury her alive. And the most twisted part? Rome worshipped these women as symbols of virtue while simultaneously terrorizing them with the possibility of the most brutal death imaginable. The story of the Vestal Virgins reveals something dark about civilization itself. When a society values purity and perfection over humanity, it becomes capable of unimaginable cruelty. These girls were worshipped as divine symbols while alive, but the moment they showed any human weakness, they were ruthlessly discarded. They lived in worship and died in silence. The ancient Greek historian Thucydides once said, "The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must." The story of the Vestal Virgins is the perfect illustration of this brutal truth. We tell this story today not to judge ancient Rome, but to remind ourselves, when we put ideals above humanity, when we demand perfection over compassion, we risk becoming monsters ourselves. What do you think? In our pursuit of perfection, do we sometimes lose sight of what makes us human? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective on this dark chapter of history.